On my 21st birthday, I stood in our family's living room, surrounded by relatives, neighbors, and business partners of my father. Everyone was dressed in suits and gowns, sipping champagne, waiting for the big announcement of what my father had planned for his two sons. My older brother Jaron stood beside me, confident as ever, and when my father called his name, the room filled with applause. He handed Jaron the keys to a Rolls-Royce Phantom, gleaming under the lights in the driveway, and announced a $2.3 million trust fund in his name. People cheered, clapped him on the back, and cameras flashed as he slid behind the wheel. Then all eyes turned to me. My heart raced, because for years I had wondered if my father saw me as the son who could live up to the family name. He reached into a leather bag and pulled out something that made the crowd whisper. It wasn't a car key, it wasn't a check, and it wasn't a wrapped box. He handed me a scuffed brown suitcase, the kind you might find abandoned at a bus station, with scratches across the surface and a broken handle. His face was unreadable. He looked me directly in the eyes and said, "You'll understand when the time's right." The room went silent. I forced a smile, but inside I felt humiliated. Jaron revved the Phantom's engine while guests congratulated him, and I stood there holding that old suitcase like a fool. That night I told myself it was worthless, but I couldn't let go of it. For years, I carried that suitcase from place to place while I scraped by in cheap motels and dead-end jobs. It became a weight I couldn't throw away, a mystery that haunted me. And last week, after 6 long years of wondering, I finally opened it. What I found inside made me drop to my knees. I grew up in the kind of household where appearances meant everything. My father, Martin Grant, was a man of stature. He built his fortune from the ground up in real estate and investments, and people in town treated him like a king. At every dinner party, every charity gala, every Sunday brunch, he was the man whose opinion everyone waited to hear. He wore his authority like a crown, sharp suits, polished shoes, and a voice that carried through any room. People feared him as much as they respected him. My mother, Clara, was the opposite. She had a gentle soul, always speaking softly, always keeping the peace. Where my father commanded, she comforted. She never challenged him in front of others, but when we were alone, she would hold my shoulder and whisper encouragement as if trying to patch the cracks his coldness left behind. Then there was Jaron, my older brother by 2 years. From as early as I can remember, Jaron was the golden child. He had my father's sharp jawline, his confidence, his ability to walk into a room and instantly own it. Teachers praised him, coaches pushed him forward, girls adored him, and my father beamed every time Jaron succeeded. I was proud of him, but I couldn't ignore the way the spotlight never seemed to shift in my direction. I was quieter, more thoughtful. I liked books more than parties, ideas more than bragging. My father never said it directly, but I always felt that to him, my quietness was weakness. I tried harder, studied longer, worked to earn his approval in ways Jaron never had to. Yet, no matter how much effort I poured in, his eyes never lit up for me the way they did for my brother. That difference between us became painfully clear on my 21st birthday. My father believed in grand gestures, and he decided to host the party at our mansion. It wasn't a family gathering, it was a spectacle. Politicians, business partners, distant relatives, neighbors who never spoke to us were suddenly dressed in tuxedos and gowns, sipping champagne under chandeliers that sparkled like stars. I remember standing on the staircase, looking down at all of them, and feeling like a guest at my own celebration. Jaron owned the night. He greeted people confidently, shaking hands, making jokes, standing tall like he had been born to play the role of heir. Every laugh he earned from the crowd felt like another reminder of how invisible I was. Still, I held on to hope. I told myself that tonight might be the night my father finally saw me. That maybe he had something planned for me too, something that showed I mattered. When my father walked onto the stage and called Jaron forward, the room filled with applause. He handed Jaron the keys to the Rolls-Royce Phantom parked outside. its silver body reflecting the floodlights. Then he announced the trust fund. $2.3 million, set aside for Jaren's future. People whistled, clapped, and shouted his name like he had won the lottery. I clapped too, even as my stomach sank. My brother smiled at me, smug, as if the universe had confirmed what he already believed. He was the chosen one. Then my father turned to me. I held my breath, my heart pounding. He reached into a leather bag at his side and pulled out the suitcase. It looked old, worn, with scratches across the surface and a broken handle. He handed it to me without expression. His voice was steady and deliberate when he said, "You'll understand when the time's right." The room went silent. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some people laughed under their breath, others looked away uncomfortably. I stood frozen, clutching that suitcase, my face burning with humiliation. My father turned back toward the guests as if the matter was settled. Jaren revved the engine of the Phantom outside, and the crowd poured out to admire it. I stayed behind, standing in the center of the room with my mother by my side. She placed a hand on my arm and whispered, "Don't let this crush you. He has his reasons." Her words were soft, but they did little to ease the sting. In that moment, it felt like my father had announced to the world that I was worth nothing. That night, after the guests left and the mansion grew quiet, I sat in my room, staring at the suitcase. I tried to convince myself it was some kind of riddle, some lesson in patience or humility, but anger gnawed at me. I thought about how Jaren was probably planning a road trip in his Phantom while I was left holding a piece of junk. I wanted to throw it out, to prove that it had no power over me. Yet I couldn't. Something about the way my father's eyes had locked onto mine when he gave it to me made it impossible to let go. So I kept it. I carried it into adulthood like an anchor tied to my life. Every time I moved apartments or found myself sleeping in another run-down motel room, that suitcase came with me. People asked why I dragged it around, and I had no answer. I told them it was just something my father gave me, but inside I felt haunted by the possibility that maybe, just maybe, it contained the answer to who I was meant to be. In the years that followed, I lived broke, working odd jobs to survive. I watched Jaren's life unfold in luxury, photos of his parties and cars plastered across social media, while I counted coins to buy meals. I resented my father for what he had done, but I couldn't stop wondering if the suitcase meant something more than humiliation. I never opened it. For years, it sat at the foot of every bed I slept in, silent and heavy, daring me to face it. And every time I thought about lifting the latches, fear gripped me. What if there was nothing inside? What if opening it only confirmed what I had always feared, that my father saw me as worthless? That fear kept me silent, carrying the suitcase like a curse, until the day came when I couldn't ignore it any longer. After my 21st birthday, my life took a direction I never could have imagined. That night marked the beginning of a division in our family that never healed. Jaren's future opened wide with privilege, while mine narrowed into struggle. I didn't have a safety net, no trust fund, no car, no promise of opportunity. All I had was the suitcase my father handed me in front of a crowd that witnessed my humiliation. At first, I tried to pretend it didn't matter. I enrolled in classes at a community college, working part-time jobs to pay for them. I stocked shelves at grocery stores, worked in diners, carried boxes in warehouses. Meanwhile, Jaren posted pictures with celebrities, vacationed in the Bahamas, and hosted parties that made headlines in the local news. Every time I saw him smiling beside that Phantom, it burned inside me. I told myself that I was different, that I didn't need what he had, but deep down I felt left behind. The suitcase never left my side. It sat at the corner of every cheap apartment I rented, and later, every motel room I barely afforded. People asked about it constantly. "What's in there?" Coworkers would joke when I dragged it into a shared break room. Friends I made for a season would tap it with their foot and say, "Why do you keep carrying that thing?" "It looks empty." I laughed it off. but the truth was more complicated. I didn't know what was inside, and I was terrified to find out. Opening it felt like crossing a line I wasn't ready to face. If it was empty or filled with junk, that would confirm what I feared most, that my father had given me nothing. If it contained something valuable, I worried I might not be ready to handle it. So I carried it, year after year, a burden that grew heavier the longer I kept it shut. My mother tried to comfort me. She would visit me in my small apartments, bringing home-cooked meals wrapped in foil. She would glance at the suitcase and sigh, her eyes heavy with unspoken words. One night, as we ate together at a shaky kitchen table, she finally said, "Eli, your father's ways are cruel, but they are never without reason. He sees something in you. He doesn't see in Jaren. Do not mistake that suitcase for an insult." Her faith in him only made me angrier. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't understand why love had to come in riddles. Why couldn't he simply say, "I believe in you," the way mothers do? Why did his version of faith look like abandonment? Meanwhile, Jaren rubbed salt into the wound. He reveled in the spotlight, and he made sure I knew it. At a family dinner, while I was barely scraping enough money to pay rent, he smirked across the table and said, "How's life in the motels treating you, little brother?" Maybe Dad's suitcase has a magic trick inside, like pulling coins out of thin air. You should open it. Maybe it'll give you lunch money. The family laughed. My father stayed silent. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, but it didn't erase the sting. I kept moving from one dead-end job to another, each one swallowing hours of my life while leaving me with just enough to survive. The suitcase was always with me. On nights when loneliness pressed too hard, I would sit on the edge of the bed and run my hand over the scratches on its surface. I wondered who had carried it before me, how it had been beaten and worn down. Sometimes I thought it looked like me, weathered, ignored, but still holding together. The weight of it became a symbol. It reminded me of what I didn't have, of the love and recognition I had been denied. It also became a source of twisted strength. No matter how hard life got, I didn't throw it away. Some part of me, buried under anger and doubt, believed that maybe my father was right. Maybe I wasn't meant to understand yet. But carrying it came with consequences. People looked at me like I was strange. Landlords asked why I only moved in with one bag. Co-workers spread rumors that I was hiding something illegal. One night, after finishing a shift at a gas station, I came back to my motel room to find the door kicked open. My heart sank. The television was gone, my few belongings scattered, but my suitcase was untouched in the corner. I remember staring at it, thinking, even thieves know it's worthless. Those years broke me in ways I didn't know I could break. There were nights when I went to bed hungry, mornings when I didn't know if I could keep going. Yet the suitcase was always there, reminding me that my story wasn't finished. I hated it, I feared it, but I couldn't let it go. By the time I turned 27, I had carried it for 6 years. I had built up an armor of bitterness, telling myself that my father had chosen Jaren as the heir and abandoned me as an experiment. The suitcase became the one mystery I had left, the single thread tying me to a family I no longer felt part of. And then, one night in a lonely roadside motel, I reached a breaking point. My life was circling the drain. I was tired of scraping by, tired of feeling like a ghost in my own family's story. I looked at the suitcase sitting by the bed and realized that I could not keep running from it forever. The fear that had stopped me for years suddenly felt smaller than the weight of carrying it. That was the night I decided I would finally open it. The night I finally decided to open the suitcase began like so many others. I was 27, living in a rundown motel off a highway outside a small town. The neon sign outside flickered, buzzing against the window pane. The carpet smelled of cigarettes. The walls were thin enough to hear the arguments of the couple next door, and the mattress sagged under my weight. It wasn't home. None of the places I had lived in during those years felt like home. That evening, I sat at the small wooden desk in the corner of the room, staring at the suitcase where it rested by the bed. Its cracked leather edges looked darker in the dim yellow light. For 6 years, it had been my unwanted companion. I had carried it through bus stations, motel lobbies, and apartment stairwells. I had cursed it, ignored it, and avoided it, yet I never left it behind. The memory of my father's voice that night on my birthday still echoed inside me. "You'll understand when the time's right." I repeated the words out loud, testing them in the silence of the room. They sounded different now. They no longer felt like a riddle from a man who wanted to humiliate me. They felt like a command. I poured myself a glass of cheap whiskey from a plastic bottle I kept on the nightstand. My hands shook as I held the glass. I wasn't shaking from the cold or exhaustion. I was shaking because the decision I had avoided for years was now staring me in the face. That suitcase had become more than an object. It had become the symbol of everything I didn't know about myself, everything I feared about my place in my family. Opening it meant facing the truth, and once I knew the truth, there would be no going back. I walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. I placed the suitcase on my lap and ran my hand across the rough surface. The handle was cracked, the latches rusted, but it still held together. I tried to imagine what my father had been thinking when he gave it to me. Why had he chosen this path for me while giving Jaren the world on a silver platter? I thought of my mother, the way she had looked at me with pity and whispered that my father had his reasons. I thought of Jaren, who had mocked me every chance he got, flaunting his wealth while sneering at my struggles. I thought of all the nights I had gone hungry, all the times I had worked until my back ached, all the moments I had felt invisible. My entire life seemed to circle around this single object, this suitcase that had followed me like a shadow. I set the suitcase on the bedspread and leaned closer. My fingers traced the metal latches. They were stiff with rust, cold to the touch. I gripped one latch and tried to push it open, but it resisted. My chest tightened. I stopped, pulled my hand back, and stared at the suitcase. Doubt crept in again. What if there was nothing inside? What if this was all a cruel joke, a way for my father to make sure I lived my life chasing after something that didn't exist? I stood up and paced the room. The neon light outside blinked red and blue across the walls. My reflection in the mirror above the dresser looked tired, almost broken. I whispered to myself, "What are you so afraid of?" The answer came quickly. I was afraid that opening it would prove once and for all that I was worth nothing to my father. I sat back down. I couldn't live like this anymore. I couldn't keep running from the truth. The fear of what I might find had kept me paralyzed for too long, but the fear of wasting my life had grown stronger. If the suitcase held nothing, then I would know. If it held something, then maybe, just maybe, it would explain everything. I placed both hands on the suitcase. My palms were sweaty, my throat dry. I closed my eyes and thought of the little boy I had been, standing in my father's shadow, desperate for recognition. I thought of the man I had become, scarred by years of struggle, but still standing. And I thought of the voice that had haunted me for 6 years. "You'll understand when the time's right." I opened my eyes and whispered, "The time is now." With one hard push, I snapped the first latch open. The sound was sharp, echoing in the silence of the room. My heart pounded. I gripped the second latch and pulled it until it gave way with a metallic snap. For a long moment, I just sat there, staring at the closed lid. My breath came heavy, my body tense, as if I was standing at the edge of a cliff. I wrapped my fingers under the lid and slowly began to lift. The hinges creaked. The smell of aged leather and dust filled the air, and I felt the weight of years lifting along with it. My eyes locked on the dark opening as it revealed the contents inside. In that instant, I knew my life was about to change forever. When the lid of the suitcase creaked open, I felt my chest tighten as if I had been holding my breath for years. Inside, there was no pile of cash, no jewelry, no hidden key to some luxury car. What I saw at first looked almost disappointing. There were old weathered journals stacked neatly, their covers faded and edges frayed. Next to them lay a bundle of envelopes tied together with twine. On top of everything was a single envelope with my name written in my father's sharp handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up. For years I had cursed this suitcase, imagined it was nothing more than an insult. Now it held the first thing my father had ever addressed to me directly. The paper was yellowed, the ink bold, each stroke of the pen deliberate. I slid a finger under the flap and tore it open. Inside was a letter. My father's words stared back at me. "Elior, if you are reading this, it means you have carried this suitcase long enough to understand what it truly represents. Your brother was given money because that is what he values. You were given this because you are meant for more. Wealth without wisdom is a burden, not a gift. The journals inside contain the story of our family. My struggles, your grandfather's struggles, every failure and lesson that built what we now own. I could not hand these to Jaron because he would never read them, but I believe you will. You will understand them when the time is right. And if you do, you will hold something far more powerful than money. You will hold legacy." I read the letter 3 times before the words fully sank in. My throat tightened, my vision blurred, and I dropped to my knees on the thin carpet. All those years of shame, all the resentment I had carried, poured out of me in tears. I had thought my father despised me, that he had humiliated me for sport. In reality, he had trusted me with something priceless. I wiped my face and opened the journals. The first belonged to my grandfather, filled with sketches of land plots, notes on deals gone wrong, and reflections on the value of persistence. He wrote about the nights he slept in his car while saving every dollar to buy his first property. He described the humiliation of being laughed at in boardrooms and the sting of loans denied, but also the lessons he carried from each failure. The second journal belonged to my father. I had never seen him as vulnerable, but here his words told a different story. He wrote about losing deals, about moments when bankruptcy loomed over him, about the loneliness of building an empire when no one believed in him. He described the pain of burying his own father and the fear that he would never live up to the legacy left behind. He admitted mistakes, pride, and anger, but every page was stitched together with determination. As I flipped through the pages, I realized my father had never been cold for the sake of cruelty. He had been forged in hardship, just as his father before him. He gave Jaron wealth because Jaron had no hunger for anything else. He gave me the suitcase because he saw hunger in me, the same hunger that had once driven him. I reached for the bundle of envelopes tied with twine. Inside were letters addressed to me at different ages, each written on birthdays I had long since passed. One for when I was 18, one for 21, another for 25. Each contained words of guidance I had never heard spoken. In them, my father admitted that he knew his methods were harsh. He confessed he was afraid of coddling me, afraid that if he gave me easy riches, I would become like Jaron. Comfortable, but shallow. One letter read, "Elior, I chose you not because you are weak, but because you are strong. A man who can carry an empty suitcase for years without giving up already knows the value of patience. When the world turns its back on you, remember that survival itself is proof of your worth. This knowledge will guide you long after money runs out." By the time I finished reading, I felt as though the ground beneath me had shifted. The anger I had clung to for so long dissolved into something heavier but purer. Grief, pride, and a strange sense of relief all mixed together. My father had not abandoned me. He had entrusted me with the essence of who we were. I thought about Jaron. I thought about the phantom parked in his garage, the parties, the friends who came for his wealth but never stayed for his character. I realized then that he had been given riches, but not responsibility. I had been given hardship, but also wisdom, and in the end, responsibility and wisdom would outlast any car or trust fund. I sat there on the motel floor, surrounded by the journals and letters, and for the first time in years, I felt a sense of purpose. This was not the end of my story. This was the beginning. That night, I promised myself that I would honor the gift I had been given. I would study every page, learn every lesson, and build something that was mine. Not to prove my father right, not to compete with Jaren, but to finally step out of the shadow and carry the legacy forward in my own way. The morning after I opened the suitcase, I felt different. The walls of the motel room were the same dull yellow, the carpet still smelled of smoke, and the air conditioner rattled in the window, but something inside me had shifted. For the first time in years, I did not feel like a victim. I felt like a man with direction. I spent the entire day reading through the journals, page by page, letter by letter. Each story pulled me deeper into the history of my family. My grandfather's words spoke of persistence in the face of humiliation. My father's reflections revealed a man who was not simply cold, but hardened by failure and determined to pass on his resilience. By the time I finished, I realized the suitcase was not a rejection. It was the inheritance I had needed most, though it came wrapped in struggle instead of ribbon. I decided I had to see my mother. She had been the only one who ever tried to comfort me, even when she could not change my father's ways. I drove into the city where she still lived in the mansion that had once felt like a palace to me, but now felt like a relic of another life. She welcomed me with open arms. When I placed the journals and letters on the table in front of her, tears filled her eyes. She picked up one of the letters and whispered, "He always loved you, Elier. He just didn't know how to show it the way I did." We sat together for hours, reading parts of the journals aloud, sometimes laughing at the younger versions of my father and grandfather, sometimes crying over the honesty of their failures. For the first time, I felt close to her in a way I had never felt before. She saw not a broken son, but a man who had finally uncovered the truth. I knew, however, that the other half of this story lived with my brother. Jaren had continued his life of luxury, posting pictures with expensive cars and private jets. But when I visited him, I saw something else in his eyes. He looked restless. He had money, but no purpose. I told him about the journals, about the suitcase, about the lessons our father had hidden in plain sight. He brushed me off at first, laughing like he always did. But when I pulled out one of the letters and read it to him, his smile faded. He excused himself and walked away without another word. That moment made me realize the difference between us. Jaren had been given everything except hunger, and without hunger there is no growth. I had been given nothing but a burden, and in carrying it, I had learned resilience, patience, and the value of legacy. The very thing I had resented for years had become the foundation of my strength. In the weeks that followed, I began to change my life. I quit the string of dead-end jobs and started studying the journals as if they were textbooks. I made notes, outlined strategies, and began applying the lessons. I took on small ventures, tested ideas, and slowly built momentum. Every success, no matter how small, felt earned, and every failure felt like another page of the journals coming to life, guiding me to keep moving forward. I also started telling people my story. At first, it was just friends who asked why I always carried that suitcase. Then it became coworkers, strangers I met in cafes, and eventually groups who invited me to speak. Every time I told the story, I saw the same reaction: the disbelief at the cruelty, the curiosity about what was inside, and the relief when they heard the truth. People connected to it because everyone has carried something heavy that they do not understand at the time. Everyone knows what it feels like to wonder if their struggle has meaning. The suitcase had been my burden, but it had also become my testimony. One evening, I sat alone with the suitcase again, this time not as a source of fear, but as a reminder. I touched the leather surface and said quietly, "I understand now." It was not about the money, the cars, or the applause my brother had received. It was about endurance. It was about proving that value is not handed to you, but discovered in the weight you are willing to carry. When I look back now, I see the years of hunger and loneliness differently. They were not wasted. They were the fire that forged me into someone capable of carrying a legacy, not just spending an inheritance. My father had chosen me not because I was weak, but because I was the one strong enough to handle the burden. So here is what I learned. Sometimes the gifts that seem cruel are the ones that prepare you for everything you will ever need. Sometimes the heaviest weight you carry is the key to your freedom. And sometimes the love of a father does not look like hugs or words of praise. Sometimes it looks like a suitcase handed to you in front of a room full of people, a burden you do not understand until the moment comes when you are ready to open it. That moment finally came for me, and it changed everything. That was the story of how a broken old suitcase, carried through years of struggle, turned out to be the greatest gift my father could have given me. It taught me that wealth without wisdom disappears, but wisdom creates wealth that lasts. It taught me that sometimes the things we resent the most are the things shaping us into who we are meant to become. If this story made you stop and think, if it pulled you in the way it pulled me through those years, I want to hear from you. Tell me in the comments what you've carried in your own life that turned out to be heavier than you expected, but ended up teaching you something you'll never forget. Make sure to give this video a like if it connected with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story. Every story we share here is about more than entertainment. It is about finding the lessons hidden inside the hardest moments of life. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.